The first thing Evelyn Carter noticed was the silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the heavy, judgmental quiet that only exists in places built for people who never expect to be challenged. The grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel glowed behind the glass doors. Crystal chandeliers, polished marble floors, the soft hum of wealth and confidence. Men in tailored tuxedos laughed easily. Women in elegant gowns held champagne flutes like they were born with them in their hands. This was not a place for mistakes. And according to everyone inside, Evelyn Carter was one. She stood just outside the entrance, her spine straight, her face calm, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. In her right hand was a worn leather clutch. In her left was her 7-year-old son, Lucas. Lucas squeezed her fingers tightly. "Mom," he whispered, his voice small but steady. "Is this the place Dad said we didn't belong?" The question cut deeper than any insult Evelyn had endured over the past 7 years. She didn't answer him right away. Instead, she looked down at her son, his dark hair neatly combed, his too-big navy blazer borrowed from a neighbor, his eyes filled with a mix of fear and hope that no child should ever have to carry. She knelt in front of him, smoothing the crease in his jacket with careful fingers. "We belong wherever we stand," she said quietly. "Always." The security guard at the door cleared his throat. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said, not unkindly but firmly. "Your name isn't on the guest list." Evelyn nodded once, as if she had expected nothing else. She had replayed this moment 1,000 times in her head. Still, hearing the words out loud felt like being erased all over again. Behind the guard, the ballroom doors swung open briefly, letting out a wave of music and laughter, and with it, a glimpse of Nathan Whitmore. Her husband. No, not just her husband. The man who had once held her hand in a cramped apartment and promised her forever. The man who had watched her give up her career, her independence, her name. The man who had later changed the locks, frozen the accounts, and told the world she had chosen to disappear. Nathan stood near the stage, confident and flawless in a black tuxedo, a woman draped elegantly on his arm. Brooke Lawson, his partner, his public future. Evelyn felt Lucas tense beside her. Nathan laughed at something Brooke whispered, completely unaware that the wife and child he had erased were standing less than 20 feet away. "Ma'am," the guard repeated gently, "you'll need to step aside." Before Evelyn could respond, another voice cut through the moment. "That won't be necessary." The guard turned. Evelyn turned. A tall man in a charcoal suit had stepped forward from the edge of the crowd, his expression unreadable, his presence commanding without effort. He glanced at Evelyn, then at Lucas, and finally toward Nathan across the room. A slow, knowing smile crossed his face. "After all," the man said calmly, "this gala wouldn't exist without her." And in that instant, Evelyn knew. Everything was about to change. Before the gala lights, before the headlines, before Nathan Whitmore learned how to smile for cameras, there was a much smaller life. And Evelyn Carter was at the center of it. They met 12 years ago in a narrow coffee shop near Wall Street, the kind with chipped mugs and flickering lights. Nathan was an ambitious analyst then, sharp suits bought on credit, dreams bigger than his bank account. Evelyn had just passed her first CPA exam. She carried a second-hand laptop in her bag and believed hard work could fix almost anything. Nathan noticed her because she listened. Not the polite kind of listening people perform while waiting to talk, but real attention. She asked questions. She remembered details. When he complained about long hours and unfair bosses, she didn't tell him to quit. She helped him plan. Late nights became shared spreadsheets on her MacBook Air, coffee rings staining the desk as she checked numbers he didn't yet know how to read. She caught errors before they became disasters. She learned his weaknesses and quietly filled them in. When Nathan got his first real break, seed money from a private investor, he proposed that same night. No ring, just a promise whispered in the dark. "We'll build this together," he said. "Just for a few years. Then I'll make it right." Evelyn believed him. She paused her certification exams. She turned down a junior accounting role at a midtown firm. She managed his books, his schedules, his life. When the company moved from a shared office to a real space, she unpacked boxes and labeled files while pregnant with their first child, who she later lost at 10 weeks, alone in a clinic waiting room because Nathan was in meetings. That was the first time she learned grief could be inconvenient. Success came fast after that. Faster than either of them expected. Nathan learned how to speak in buzzwords. Investors learned his name. And slowly, without a conversation, Evelyn learned she was no longer introduced. At events, Nathan called her my wife, but never my partner. At meetings, he asked her to wait outside. When she questioned the new financial structure, he smiled and said, "Trust me." The documents appeared after Lucas was born. Papers placed carefully on the dining table beside a cold cup of Starbucks coffee she never finished. "It's just to simplify things," Nathan said. "For liability, for protection." She signed while exhausted, still bleeding, still trying to be a good wife. That night, Evelyn sat on the edge of the bed, Lucas asleep against her chest, and realized something had shifted. She could feel it in the quiet. In the way Nathan checked his phone instead of looking at his son. In the way her name was missing from emails she used to write. She didn't know then that she was being erased. She only knew that everything she helped build was no longer hers, and that realization, small and almost invisible at the time, was the beginning of everything that followed. Brooke Lawson entered Nathan Whitmore's life the same way everything dangerous does, quietly, professionally, and under the guise of necessity. She was introduced as a solution. Nathan brought her name home one night while scrolling through emails on his phone, barely looking up. "She's a communications strategist," he said. "The investors want someone who understands image, public perception." Evelyn was folding laundry on the couch, Lucas asleep beside her, his small chest rising and falling. She nodded, too tired to ask why a growing company suddenly needed a specialist in narratives. Brooke was younger than Evelyn expected when they met, polished but not flashy, intelligent eyes that assessed everything in seconds. She shook Evelyn's hand firmly and smiled just long enough to appear sincere. "It's so nice to finally meet you," Brooke said. "Nathan talks about the early days all the time." It sounded like respect. It wasn't. Within weeks, Brooke became a constant presence. Emails CC'd to her that used to go to Evelyn. Meetings rescheduled without notice. Decisions made before Evelyn was informed. Brooke never raised her voice or crossed a line openly. She didn't have to. She planted ideas instead. At a dinner with investors, Evelyn overheard Brooke say softly, "Nathan's personal life has been complicated. We're working on clarifying the brand." Clarifying. As if a marriage were a smudge to be wiped clean. The shift was subtle, but relentless. Brooke suggested Nathan stop bringing Evelyn to public events for now. She encouraged a more streamlined image. One founder, one face, one story. Evelyn felt it most in the small humiliations. A charity gala invitation addressed only to Nathan. A company newsletter that referred to him as single-minded and unattached. A photo shoot where Brooke gently guided Evelyn out of frame with a hand on her elbow and a practiced smile. "You understand," Brooke whispered once. "It's not personal. It's optics." Nathan didn't argue. That was the part that hurt the most. The breaking point came on an ordinary afternoon. Evelyn stopped by the office to drop off paperwork Nathan had forgotten. As she passed Brooke's glass-walled office, she heard her son's name. "Lucas is a liability," Brooke said calmly into her headset. If the press connects him to Nathan right now, it complicates everything. Evelyn froze. A child changes the narrative, Brooke continued, especially one tied to a woman who isn't aligned with the company's future. Evelyn walked out without being seen. She sat in her car for a long time, hands shaking on the steering wheel, the city blurring through her tears. That night, she confronted Nathan. She called our son a liability, Evelyn said, her voice steady only because she had nothing left to lose. Nathan sighed, rubbing his temples. She's just doing her job. That was when Evelyn understood. Brooke hadn't stolen her husband. She had simply named the cost of keeping him, and Nathan had agreed to pay it. Evelyn never remembered the exact moment the papers were placed in her hands, only the feeling that she was too tired to fight. The hospital room was dim, the blinds half closed against a gray Manhattan morning. Lucas lay in the bassinet beside her, wrapped in a blue blanket, his tiny fingers curling and uncurling like he was testing the world. Evelyn's body ached in ways she hadn't known were possible. Every breath felt borrowed. Every thought moved through fog. Nathan stood near the window, phone pressed to his ear, his voice low and urgent. Even then, even hours after their son was born, business came first. A knock came at the door. A woman stepped inside, dressed neatly in a tailored blazer, holding a thin folder. She smiled politely, the way professionals do when they want to appear harmless. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said, "I won't take much of your time." Nathan ended his call and turned. "This is just some standard paperwork," he said quickly. "Company stuff. It can't wait." Evelyn tried to sit up, but pain shot through her side. Her head throbbed. She hadn't slept in nearly 2 days. The nurse had left minutes earlier, and the room felt suddenly too quiet. The woman placed the folder on the tray table and slid it closer. "It's a confidentiality agreement," she said smoothly. "It protects everyone involved. Given Nathan's public position, discretion is important." Evelyn frowned. "What does this have to do with me?" Nathan didn't meet her eyes. "It's just temporary. A formality. You don't need to worry about the details." She looked down at the pages, dense paragraphs. Legal language, words like liability, representation, consent. Her vision blurred halfway through the first page. "I need a lawyer," Evelyn said softly. Nathan checked his watch. "Evelyn, please. You're exhausted. We'll explain it later." The woman leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. "This simply ensures there are no misunderstandings during a sensitive period. You'll still be taken care of." Taken care of. The phrase sounded comforting. It wasn't. Evelyn thought of Lucas, of how small he looked, of how fragile everything felt. She thought of being difficult, of causing tension, of doing the wrong thing at the wrong moment. Her hand trembled as she picked up the pen. "Just sign here," the woman said, pointing. Evelyn hesitated, her heart pounding. "This doesn't change anything between us, right?" she asked Nathan. He smiled. The familiar smile she wanted so badly to trust. "Of course not." She signed. The pen scratched across the paper, sealing something she didn't yet understand. When she finished, the woman closed the folder and stood. "Congratulations on your beautiful son," she said, already moving toward the door. When they were alone again, Evelyn leaned back against the pillow, drained. Nathan kissed her forehead. "You did the right thing." But later that night, when Evelyn reached for her phone to check the shared bank account, the app wouldn't load. When she tried to access her email, the password had been changed. When she searched her name in company records weeks later, it was gone. That hospital signature hadn't protected her. It had erased her. Evelyn Carter did not leave Manhattan with a dramatic exit. There were no shouting matches, no public scenes, no slammed doors. She left quietly, the way people do when they have already been erased. The morning she packed, the penthouse felt unfamiliar, like a place she had only visited once. Nathan was already gone. His closet was untouched. His toothbrush still sat by the sink, but the air between them was gone, hollow and final. Evelyn folded Lucas's clothes into 2 suitcases and placed her own things into cardboard boxes she'd ordered online, delivered without a return address. By noon, she was standing on the sidewalk with everything she owned and a 6-month-old baby strapped to her chest. The doorman avoided her eyes. A rideshare took her across the bridge into Queens. She watched the Manhattan skyline shrink in the window, each tower a reminder of something she had helped build but was no longer allowed to touch. The apartment she found was small, 1 bedroom, thin walls, a single window that looked out onto a brick alley. But it was clean, and it was quiet, and it was hers. She set Lucas's crib beside the bed and slept on the floor the first night, one hand reaching out to make sure he was still there. The money Nathan had promised never came. The joint accounts stayed frozen. Her credit cards were declined. Emails to Nathan's office went unanswered. When she finally received a response, it was from a lawyer reminding her of the agreement she had signed and warning her against public statements. Evelyn learned quickly how invisible a woman becomes without access. She took the first job she could find, part-time administrative work at a small design firm in Brooklyn. The pay barely covered rent and childcare. She worked mornings, rushed to pick up Lucas, and worked nights after he fell asleep, staring at spreadsheets she was no longer allowed to sign. Some nights, exhaustion won. She cried quietly in the bathroom so Lucas wouldn't hear. What hurt more than the financial struggle was the silence. Nathan never asked about his son. No birthday cards, no visits, no acknowledgement. Online, he gave interviews about focus and sacrifice, about choosing work over distractions. He smiled easily when asked about his personal life. Evelyn stopped correcting the story. There was no one listening anyway. Years passed that way. Lucas grew from a baby into a boy with thoughtful eyes and questions she sometimes didn't know how to answer. He learned not to ask about his father, sensing the pain in her pauses. At night, when his anxiety flared, Evelyn lay beside him, counting his breaths, reminding him that he was safe. She told herself survival was enough, but there were moments, small, sharp ones, when survival didn't feel like living. Like the day Lucas came home from school asking why his last name was different from his classmates' dads. Or the afternoon she saw Nathan's face on a billboard in Manhattan, larger than life, untouchable. That was when Evelyn understood the true cost of being forgotten. Not poverty, not loneliness, but the slow erosion of dignity. And deep inside, beneath the fear and fatigue, something else began to grow. Not hope, resolve. The first letter arrived in a plain white envelope, slipped between grocery flyers and overdue utility notices. Evelyn almost threw it away. She opened it while standing at the kitchen counter, Lucas coloring quietly at the small table behind her. The words blurred at first, then sharpened into something cold and official. Notice of concern regarding custodial suitability. Her hands began to shake. The letter claimed an anonymous report had been filed questioning Evelyn's mental stability and her ability to provide a structured environment for her child. It requested a meeting, an evaluation, a review. Evelyn sank into a chair, the room spinning. She didn't need to see the signature to know where it came from. Nathan had finally remembered his son. Not to love him, but to take him. The school was next. The guidance counselor called Evelyn in one afternoon with a careful smile and a tone that tried too hard to sound neutral. She asked questions that didn't make sense, about Lucas's sleep, his anxiety, his home life. Lucas seems sensitive, the counselor said gently. Has he experienced instability? Evelyn felt something break open inside her chest. That night, Lucas woke up crying from a nightmare. He clung to her, his small body trembling. "They said Daddy doesn't want me," he whispered. Evelyn froze. "Who said that?" Lucas wiped his eyes. "A lady at school. She asked why my dad never comes. She said maybe it's better this way." Evelyn held him tighter, fighting the urge to scream. Within weeks, everything escalated. A second letter arrived, this one from a law firm she recognized. Nathan's firm. It accused her of emotional volatility, referenced her hospitalization period after childbirth, and suggested that Lucas's anxiety was proof of her inadequacy. They wanted shared custody. No, they wanted leverage. Evelyn sat across from a free legal aid attorney who flipped through the documents with a frown. "They're building a narrative," he said carefully. "They're not accusing you outright. They're implying." "Can they take him?" Evelyn asked, barely able to form the words. The attorney hesitated. "With enough resources, they can try." That night, Evelyn couldn't sleep. She watched Lucas breathe, counting every rise and fall of his chest, terrified that someone could come and tell her she wasn't enough. For the first time in years, she doubted herself. Maybe she wasn't strong enough. Maybe surviving wasn't enough. Maybe loving her child wasn't enough. The breaking point came when she discovered the email. An old co-worker from Nathan's company forwarded it anonymously. No message attached, just a screenshot. Subject, Risk Assessment, Lucas Carter. Below it, a single line burned into Evelyn's memory. The child represents a long-term liability to Nathan Whitmore's brand if left uncontrolled. Liability, her son reduced to a threat. Evelyn closed her laptop and slid down the wall until she was sitting on the floor, her breath coming in sharp, broken pieces. Lucas stood in the doorway, watching her with wide eyes. "Mom," he asked softly, "are we in trouble?" She pulled him into her arms, pressing her face into his hair. "No," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "But they are." And for the first time since she'd been erased, Evelyn stopped running. Because if they wanted a fight, she would no longer disappear quietly. The email arrived at 2:17 a.m., quietly lighting up Evelyn's phone while the apartment slept. She almost ignored it. Years of being shut out had trained her not to expect help, especially not from Nathan's world. But the subject line stopped her cold. "You should see this. No name, no explanation, just an attachment." Evelyn slipped out of bed and went into the kitchen, closing the door softly behind her. The hum of the refrigerator was the only sound as she opened her laptop, hands unsteady. For a long moment she stared at the screen, afraid of what might confirm her worst fears. Then she clicked. It was an internal email chain. Nathan's company logo sat neatly at the top. The sender was someone she recognized instantly, Megan Foster, a former finance manager who had quietly disappeared from the firm 2 years earlier. Evelyn scrolled. The words felt unreal, like she was reading something meant for another life. "Legal exposure remains manageable if we maintain the position that Evelyn Carter is emotionally unstable. Child's presence complicates investor confidence. Recommendation: distance, deny, delay." Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. There were replies beneath it, names she knew, executives she had once shared coffee with, and then one line that made her physically recoil. Lucas cannot be allowed to surface publicly. Surface, as if her son were a leak, a defect, something to be buried. Evelyn pressed a hand to her mouth to keep from making a sound. Her chest felt tight, her vision narrowing as years of doubt suddenly rearranged themselves into something brutally clear. This wasn't about concern. This was strategy. She scrolled further and found an attachment labeled Risk Overview, Family Assets. It listed projected losses, media scenarios, and legal outcomes. Next to Lucas's name was a red tag, High Impact Variable. Evelyn closed the laptop and leaned against the counter, sliding slowly to the floor. So this was it. This was why Nathan had vanished. This was why the money never came. This was why silence had been enforced with lawyers instead of apologies. Lucas wasn't forgotten. He was inconvenient. A soft knock came at the kitchen door. "Mom," Lucas whispered. Evelyn wiped her face quickly and opened it. He stood there in his pajamas, clutching his blanket, eyes searching hers. "Did I do something wrong?" he asked. The question shattered her. She knelt in front of him, holding his face in her hands. "No," she said firmly. "You did nothing wrong. Ever." He studied her as if trying to decide whether to believe her. "Then why do they keep being mean?" Evelyn pulled him into her arms, her jaw tightening with something new, something sharp and unmovable. "Because they're scared," she said softly. "And people who are scared do bad things." That night, after Lucas fell asleep beside her, Evelyn forwarded the email to herself 3 times. She saved copies. She printed it at work the next day and hid it in a folder beneath old tax returns. For the first time in 7 years, she had proof, not of betrayal, not of abandonment, but of intent. And somewhere deep inside, the part of her that had survived everything finally stood up straight. They hadn't just erased her. They had underestimated her. The knock came at 8:06 a.m., sharp and official, cutting through the quiet of the apartment like a blade. Evelyn knew before she opened the door. 2 women stood in the hallway. One held a clipboard. The other wore the careful, neutral expression of someone trained not to take sides. "Ms. Carter," the woman said, "we're with Child Protective Services. We need to ask you a few questions." Lucas appeared behind Evelyn, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "Mom," he said, his voice already tense. Evelyn stepped forward instinctively, blocking him with her body. "Is there a problem?" "We received a report expressing concern about emotional distress in the household," the woman replied. "This won't take long." That was a lie. They sat at the small kitchen table, the same table where Evelyn had helped Lucas with homework and counted bills late at night. The questions came gently at first, about routines, about discipline, about sleep. Then they shifted. "Have you ever been treated for anxiety or depression? Were you prescribed medication after childbirth? Has Lucas witnessed conflict between you and his father?" Each question felt like a brick added to a wall closing in around her. Lucas sat silently in the corner, clutching his backpack, his eyes darting between the adults. Evelyn caught the moment he realized this wasn't a normal visit. "This is because of my ex-husband," Evelyn said carefully. "He's trying to take my son." The woman with the clipboard made a note but didn't respond. After 40 minutes, they stood to leave. "We'll be in touch," one of them said. "Until then, we recommend cooperation." The door closed. Lucas burst into tears. "They're going to take me, aren't they?" he sobbed, burying his face into her shirt. "I'll be good, I promise." Evelyn dropped to her knees. Holding him so tightly it hurt. "No," she said, fighting panic with every breath. "No one is taking you." But when she was alone later, she wasn't so sure. That afternoon, her phone rang again. This time it was a private number. "Evelyn Carter," a man's voice said calmly. "My name is Julian Reed. I believe we need to talk." She almost hung up. "I know about the report," he continued, "and the emails." Her heart skipped. "Who are you?" "Someone who has been cleaning up Nathan Whitmore's messes for years," he replied, "and someone who doesn't like it when children are used as leverage." They met the next morning in a quiet cafe near Central Park. Julian was older than she expected, controlled, observant. He listened more than he spoke. "They're building a case," he said plainly, "not because you're unfit, because you're inconvenient." Evelyn clenched her hands. "Then why help me?" Julian's gaze hardened. Because Nathan crossed a line he can't walk back from. He slid a folder across the table. Inside were documents Evelyn had never seen, trust filings, asset structures, a name that made her breath catch, Lucas Carter. "This," Julian said, "is why they're scared." Evelyn looked up, her pulse roaring in her ears. For the first time, the fight was no longer one-sided, and for the first time since the knock at her door, she felt something stronger than fear. She felt leverage. The hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning, the kind of gray, indifferent day that made everything feel heavier than it already was. Evelyn barely slept the night before. She lay awake beside Lucas, listening to his breathing, memorizing it the way people do when they're afraid something might be taken from them. Every rise and fall of his chest felt precious, fragile, temporary. At 6:30 a.m., she woke him gently. "It's just a meeting," she said, forcing a calm she didn't feel. "We'll be back before lunch." Lucas nodded but didn't smile. He dressed quietly, his small hands clumsy with buttons. When he looked up at her, his eyes were serious in a way no child's should be. "If they ask," he said, "I'll tell them you're a good mom." The words nearly broke her. The family court building in downtown Brooklyn was cold and impersonal, all hard benches and flickering fluorescent lights. Nathan's legal team was already there when Evelyn arrived. 3 attorneys, expensive suits, confident expressions. Nathan wasn't with them. That, she realized, was deliberate. The hearing began without ceremony. Nathan's lead attorney spoke smoothly, presenting concerns with rehearsed concern. He referenced medical records from Evelyn's postpartum period. He spoke of emotional volatility and environmental instability. Evelyn listened, numb, as her life was reduced to bullet points. When it was her turn, she stood on shaking legs. She answered every question honestly, about money, about fear, about exhaustion. She didn't cry. She didn't raise her voice. Still, she could feel the room leaning away from her. The judge glanced down at his notes. "Ms. Carter," he said carefully, "given the information presented, the court is considering a temporary change in custodial arrangements pending further evaluation." Temporary? The word echoed like a sentence. Evelyn's vision blurred. Her knees threatened to give out. She thought of Lucas sleeping alone in a strange house, thought of strangers telling him when he could see his mother. She reached for the edge of the table to steady herself. Then a voice spoke from the back of the room. "Your Honor, I request permission to submit additional evidence." Everyone turned. Julian Reed stepped forward calmly, dressed in a simple dark suit, his presence immediately shifting the energy in the room. He handed a folder to the clerk. "These documents demonstrate that the petitioner's claims are not made in good faith," Julian said evenly. "They are part of a broader strategy to conceal financial obligations and suppress a legal heir." Nathan's attorneys stiffened. Julian continued, "Furthermore, I am prepared to testify that any separation of this child from his mother would directly contradict existing trust provisions tied to the child's welfare." The judge frowned, scanning the pages. Evelyn's breath caught. The hearing was paused. Outside the courtroom, Evelyn collapsed onto a bench, her body shaking uncontrollably. Lucas climbed onto her lap, wrapping his arms around her neck. "Did I do okay?" he asked. She kissed his forehead, tears finally spilling over. "You were perfect." The fight wasn't over. She knew that. But for the first time since the knock on her door, the ground beneath her feet stopped crumbling. And across the hall, unseen by Evelyn, Nathan Whitmore watched from behind a glass partition, his confident mask cracking. Because for the first time, he realized something terrifying. He might not win. Julian Reed did not offer comfort. That was the first thing Evelyn noticed after the hearing. They sat across from each other in a quiet corner of a cafe near the courthouse, the kind of place where people spoke softly and didn't ask questions. Lucas was at a nearby table with hot chocolate, distracted by his tablet, giving them the illusion of privacy. "You should understand something," Julian said, his voice calm, measured. "I'm not doing this because I feel sorry for you." Evelyn met his gaze without flinching. "I didn't ask for pity." A flicker of approval crossed his face. "Good," he said, "because pity doesn't last. Leverage does." He slid a folder across the table, thinner than the one before, but heavier in consequence. Inside were documents Evelyn barely recognized: corporate filings, trust amendments, internal correspondence. Her eyes scanned the pages until one name appeared again and again: Lucas Carter. Julian watched her carefully. Nathan didn't just hide his son, he said. He structured assets around him, insurance buffers, deferred holdings. If Lucas is acknowledged publicly, those protections activate, billions shift. Evelyn's stomach turned. "So my child is what? A trigger?" "A safeguard," Julian corrected, "and a liability, depending on who controls the narrative." Evelyn closed the folder slowly. "Why are you telling me this?" Julian leaned back, folding his hands. "Because Nathan is burning everything my family built, and because I won't allow a child to be used as collateral." Family. The word lingered. "You said my family," Evelyn said carefully. Julian's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Nathan Whitmore is my half-brother." The room seemed to tilt. "He doesn't talk about you," Evelyn said. Julian gave a short, humorless smile. "He wouldn't." He explained then. About their shared mother, about the inheritance Nathan squandered, about how Julian spent years cleaning up the damage quietly, until Nathan crossed a line that couldn't be erased with money or lawyers. "I won't protect him anymore," Julian said, "but I also won't play hero. This won't be easy." Evelyn nodded slowly. "Nothing ever is." Julian studied her for a moment. "If you continue, they'll come harder. Smear campaigns, psychological evaluations, financial pressure. You could still lose." Evelyn glanced at Lucas, laughing softly at something on the screen. "I already lost everything once," she said. "I survived it. He didn't." Julian exhaled, as if making a decision. "Then we proceed carefully." "What do you want in return?" she asked. "Truth," he replied, "and patience." He stood gathering his coat. "There's a gala next week. The Plaza, 5th Avenue. Nathan will be there. Press, investors, donors." Evelyn's heart skipped. "I'm not invited." Julian paused, then turned back to her. "You don't need to be." As he walked away, Evelyn felt the weight of the moment settle in her chest. Fear was still there. So was uncertainty. But for the first time, someone wasn't asking her to disappear quietly. Someone was asking her to stand. And in the reflection of the cafe window, Evelyn barely recognized the woman staring back. She wasn't erased anymore. She was preparing to return. The days leading up to the gala felt unreal, like Evelyn was living inside someone else's life. Nothing changed on the surface. She still woke up early, packed Lucas's lunch, rode the subway to Brooklyn, answered emails, balanced invoices. The same cracked sidewalk, the same coffee shop on the corner, the same quiet apartment where fear still lingered in the walls. But underneath it all, everything was different. Julian didn't give speeches or pep talks. He didn't promise protection or victory. What he gave her instead was preparation. They met in borrowed spaces, conference rooms after hours, quiet offices overlooking the city, places that smelled like polished wood and decisions. Julian laid out facts the way a surgeon lays out tools. "This isn't about revenge," he told her once, sliding a document across the table. "It's about control of the narrative." Evelyn learned how her silence had been used against her. How the absence of her voice had allowed Nathan's version of events to harden into truth. She learned which journalists would listen and which wouldn't. which board members already suspected something was wrong, which donors cared more about children than returns. Most importantly, she learned what not to do. "Don't cry," Julian said plainly. "They expect that. Don't explain. They'll twist it. Say only what's true and only when it matters." At night, after Lucas fell asleep, Evelyn practiced standing still in front of the mirror. Not smiling, not shrinking, just standing. It felt unnatural at first, like wearing shoes that didn't fit. Lucas watched her one evening from the couch. "Are you mad?" he asked. "No," she said, sitting beside him. "I'm getting ready." "For what?" She hesitated. "To remind some people that we exist." Lucas considered that, then nodded seriously. "Okay." There were moments when doubt crept in, when Evelyn remembered how easily she had been pushed aside before, when fear whispered that stepping into that room could cost her everything. One night she woke from a dream where the gala doors closed in her face again. Her heart raced as she sat up in bed, breath shallow, hands shaking. She almost texted Julian to cancel. Instead, she walked into Lucas's room and watched him sleep. His brow was furrowed even in rest, as if he carried worries too big for his age. She brushed his hair back gently. "This is why," she whispered to the dark. 2 days before the gala, Julian handed her a simple envelope. "What's this?" she asked. "A choice," he said. "You can walk in with me, or you can walk in alone. Either way, they'll see you." Evelyn held the envelope without opening it. "What would you do?" Julian met her gaze. "I would walk in with the truth." On the morning of the gala, Evelyn dressed slowly. No borrowed clothes, no disguise, just a simple, elegant dress she paid for herself. When Lucas straightened his tie in the mirror, he smiled for the first time in days. "Mom," he said, "I'm not scared anymore." Evelyn swallowed hard. Neither was she. Because this time she wasn't walking into that room to beg for space. She was walking in to take it. The Plaza Hotel rose over Fifth Avenue like it always had. Untouchable, luminous, indifferent to the lives it swallowed whole. Evelyn stood across the street, holding Lucas's hand, watching black cars glide up to the entrance as if on a silent conveyor belt of privilege. Valets opened doors. Laughter spilled onto the sidewalk. Camera flashes popped like distant fireworks. This was Nathan Whitmore's world. Once, she had belonged to it. Lucas shifted beside her. "That's a lot of people," he said quietly. "Yes," Evelyn replied. "And they all think they know the story." They crossed the street together. At the entrance, the security checkpoint slowed everything. Names were checked, invitations scanned, wristbands placed. Evelyn watched the rhythm of it, steady and unyielding, like a gate that decided who mattered. "Invitation?" the guard asked. Evelyn lifted her chin. "I don't have one." The guard frowned slightly, already preparing the polite refusal. "I'm sorry, ma'am." Before he could finish, a familiar voice cut through the noise. "She's with me." Julian Reed stepped forward, calm and unmistakable. The guard straightened immediately, recognition flashing across his face. "Mr. Reed," he said quickly. "Of course." Julian glanced at Evelyn. "Shall we?" She nodded once. The doors opened. The ballroom swallowed them whole. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen constellations above polished marble floors. Music floated through the air, soft and elegant. Everywhere Evelyn looked, she saw money-wearing manners, custom suits, silk gowns, watches that cost more than her apartment. And then she saw him. Nathan stood near the stage, champagne in hand, laughing easily as Brooke Lawson leaned close, her hand resting possessively on his arm. He looked relaxed, untouchable, like a man who believed the past had been neatly buried. Evelyn felt Lucas's grip tighten. "That's him," he whispered. "Yes," she said. "Stay with me." They moved forward slowly. Heads turned. At first, it was subtle. A pause in conversation, a second glance. Then recognition spread like a ripple through water. Whispers followed. Phones lowered. Eyes widened. Nathan noticed the shift and turned. The smile slid off his face. For a moment, the room seemed to tilt. His gaze locked onto Evelyn, then dropped to Lucas. Color drained from his expression so fast it was almost frightening. Brooke followed his line of sight. Her confident posture stiffened. Her fingers curled slightly as if she were holding on to something invisible. Evelyn didn't stop walking. She didn't rush. She didn't hesitate. Each step felt deliberate, grounded, like she was reclaiming territory one breath at a time. Lucas looked up at her. "Mom." She squeezed his hand gently. "I'm here." Julian slowed beside her, giving her space without leaving her side. He didn't lead. He didn't shield. He simply stood where he could be seen. They reached the center of the room. The music softened. Conversation stalled. The air grew heavy with anticipation. Nathan opened his mouth, but no sound came out. Evelyn met his eyes. For the first time in years, he couldn't look away, because she hadn't come back quietly. She had come back visible, and everyone was watching. For several seconds, no one spoke. The ballroom, moments ago filled with effortless laughter and polite noise, slipped into an unnatural quiet. Even the music seemed to retreat, fading into a distant echo that made every breath feel too loud. Evelyn stood still at the center of it all, Lucas's small hand warm in hers. She could feel his heartbeat through his palm, fast but steady. She focused on that rhythm, anchoring herself to it. Nathan was the first to move. "Evelyn," he said, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "This isn't the place." The words landed exactly where she expected them to. She didn't respond right away. Instead, she looked around the room, at the donors who had funded his rise, at the board members who had trusted his numbers, at the reporters pretending not to watch. "This," she said calmly, "is exactly the place." Nathan stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You're causing a scene." Lucas shifted beside her. "Mom," he whispered, "am I in trouble?" Evelyn knelt in front of him, blocking Nathan from view. She adjusted his jacket collar, her hands gentle and deliberate. "No," she said softly. "You're just standing with me." She stood and faced Nathan again. "You told people I disappeared," Evelyn said, her voice clear enough to carry. "You told them I was unstable, that I chose to leave." Nathan glanced around, aware now that every word mattered. "Evelyn, please. We can talk privately." She shook her head. "You had years for private." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Brooke Lawson finally spoke, her tone sharp with irritation. "This is inappropriate. Security—" Julian took a single step forward. "She's speaking," he said calmly. The authority in his voice stopped everything. Evelyn felt the shift immediately. The room leaned in. She looked back at Nathan. "You erased us," she said. "But you forgot one thing." She gestured down to Lucas. "You forgot that children grow." Lucas looked up at her, uncertain. "Do you remember what you asked me outside?" Evelyn said gently. He nodded. "I asked if we belonged here." She turned back to Nathan. "Answer him." Nathan's face tightened. "This is ridiculous." Evelyn didn't blink. "Answer him." The silence stretched, heavy and unbearable. Lucas looked at his father, his voice small but steady. "Do I belong here, Dad?" The word "Dad" landed like a dropped glass. Nathan opened his mouth, closed it. His eyes darted to the watching faces, to the cameras now openly raised, to the donors whose opinions suddenly mattered. Brooke's composure cracked. "Nathan, say something." He didn't. Evelyn felt a strange calm wash over her. "You see," she said quietly, "that's the answer." Julian stepped forward beside her. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said evenly, "there are documents tonight that deserve your attention." Nathan spun toward him. "You don't have the right—" Julian met his gaze. "I have every right." Evelyn squeezed Lucas's hand. The room was no longer frozen in confusion. It was holding its breath, because the story everyone thought they knew was about to collapse. Julian didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The moment he spoke, the room adjusted around him, instinctively recognizing authority the way it always did. Conversation stopped. A few donors subtly stepped closer. Phones lifted, no longer hidden. "Before anyone asks security to intervene," Julian said evenly, "it's important to understand why Evelyn Carter and her son are here tonight." Nathan's jaw clenched. "This is a private event." Julian turned slightly, his tone calm but unyielding. "Funded by public donors, governed by fiduciary responsibility, and tied directly to the financial structures you control." The words landed hard. Evelyn felt Lucas shift beside her. She squeezed his hand, grounding them both. Julian continued. "For years, Nathan Whitmore has presented himself as an unattached executive, a man unburdened by personal obligations. That narrative was not accidental." Nathan took a step forward. "You're crossing a line." Julian looked at him almost sadly. "You crossed it first." He nodded toward the large screen behind the stage, normally reserved for charity presentations. A technician hesitated, then followed Julian's quiet instruction. The screen lit up. Names appeared. Dates, legal filings, gasps rippled through the ballroom. Evelyn saw Brooke's face drain of color as she recognized the documents: trust amendments, asset shelters, clauses tied to a single condition, public acknowledgement of a legal heir. Julian spoke again, his voice steady. "Lucas Carter is not a rumor. He is not an allegation. He is a documented beneficiary of multiple trusts established under the Whitmore family holdings." Nathan shook his head sharply. "This is confidential." "And yet," Julian replied, "here it is." Evelyn felt her chest tighten, not with fear this time, but with something dangerously close to relief. For years, the truth had lived in shadows, whispered and doubted. Now it stood under crystal chandeliers. Brooke stepped forward abruptly. "This is a misunderstanding," she said too quickly. "Those documents were internal drafts, hypothetical risk scenarios." Julian's eyes flicked to her. "Then perhaps you shouldn't have labeled a child a high-impact liability in official correspondence." A hush fell. Someone near the front whispered, "Did he just say liability?" Brooke's mouth opened, then closed. For the first time, her composure cracked. Nathan turned toward Evelyn, his voice low and furious. "You planned this." Evelyn met his gaze, her voice quiet but unshakable. "You forced it." She knelt again in front of Lucas, smoothing his sleeve. "You okay?" He nodded, eyes wide but steady. "Are they mad at us?" "No," she said softly. "They're listening." Julian stepped back, giving Evelyn space. It wasn't his moment anymore. Evelyn stood and faced the room. "I didn't come here for money," she said, "or revenge. I came because my son deserves to exist without being hidden." Her eyes swept the crowd. "If that makes anyone uncomfortable, that's not our burden." Silence answered her, not hostile, not dismissive, respectful. And somewhere near the stage, Nathan Whitmore finally understood something irreversible. The story was no longer his to control. For a brief moment after Evelyn finished speaking, no one moved. Then Brooke Lawson broke. "This is insane," she said sharply, stepping forward, her voice cutting through the silence like glass. You're all letting yourselves be manipulated by a bitter ex-wife and a child who doesn't understand what he's being used for." The word used echoed. Evelyn felt Lucas flinch beside her. She placed a steadying hand on his shoulder, but she didn't look away from Brooke. Julian did. "Careful," he said quietly. Brooke laughed, a brittle sound that didn't reach her eyes. "Careful? This is exactly what I warned about. Emotional theatrics. This is a charity gala, not a family therapy session." She turned toward the crowd, trying to regain control. "Ladies and gentlemen, I've managed crisis communications for over a decade. What you're seeing is a classic provocation tactic, a staged ambush designed to—" "You wrote the email," Evelyn said calmly. Brooke froze. Evelyn took a small step forward, her voice steady, clear. "The one that called my son a liability. You wrote it. At 11:42 p.m. on a Sunday. You copied legal. You blind copied Nathan." A murmur rippled through the room. Brooke's eyes flicked to Nathan. "Tell her to stop." Nathan didn't speak. Evelyn continued. "You didn't just help erase us, you documented it." Brooke's composure fractured. "That email was taken out of context." Julian tilted his head slightly. "Then please explain the context." She opened her mouth and said too much. "It was a risk assessment," Brooke snapped. "That's my job. Children complicate valuations. Investors don't like uncertainty. Everyone in this room knows that." The words hung in the air, naked and unforgivable. A donor near the front lowered her glass. Another shook his head slowly. Phones came up openly now. Someone whispered, "Did she just say children complicate valuations?" Nathan finally found his voice. "Brooke, stop!" She turned on him, eyes blazing. "Don't pretend you didn't agree. You approved every line. You said—" "Enough," Julian said, his voice firm. Brooke's breath came fast. She looked around, realizing too late that the room had turned. The sympathy she expected wasn't there, only distance. Evelyn felt something settle in her chest. Not triumph, not anger, clarity. She knelt beside Lucas once more. "Do you want to step back for a minute?" she asked gently. Lucas shook his head. "I want to stay." She stood and faced Brooke. "You see," Evelyn said quietly, "this is what happens when you forget that people are not strategies." Brooke's eyes filled with panic. "Security," she called, her voice cracking. "Security!" No one moved, because at that moment the people who had always protected Nathan Whitmore were no longer sure he was worth protecting, and Nathan knew it. He looked at Evelyn, really looked at her, for the first time in years. Not as a problem, not as a liability, but as the person holding the truth he could no longer outrun. And that truth was unraveling him, thread by thread, in front of everyone who mattered. The first sign that everything had shifted was the silence from the board. Not outrage, not denial, calculation. Men and women who had built fortunes by reading risk stood perfectly still, watching Nathan Whitmore the way predators watch wounded prey. The scandal was no longer emotional. It was measurable. Julian broke the pause. "There's one more detail," he said evenly. "One that explains why this situation was buried so carefully." Nathan's head snapped up. "Julian, don't!" Julian ignored him. He turned toward the board members seated near the stage. 6 years ago, when these trusts were created, Nathan claimed sole executive authority. What he did not disclose was that he no longer met the eligibility requirements. A murmur rippled. "What requirements?" someone asked. Julian's gaze stayed fixed on Nathan. "Mental fitness clauses, clauses triggered by medical disclosures." Evelyn felt her stomach drop. Nathan stiffened. "That's confidential." "Yes," Julian replied. "Which is why you falsified the timeline." Julian nodded to the screen again. New documents appeared. Hospital records, dates, signatures. 2 months after Lucas was born, Julian continued, Nathan entered treatment for acute stress disorder following a financial collapse he concealed from investors. Under Whitmore Holdings' own bylaws, that should have suspended his unilateral control. Gasps echoed through the ballroom. Brooks staggered back a step. That's not, and, Julian added calmly, instead of disclosing this, Nathan redirected attention. He constructed a narrative of an unstable wife. He weaponized postpartum records that were never his to use. The room turned cold. Evelyn felt Lucas press closer to her side. She wrapped an arm around him instinctively. Nathan's voice cracked. "You don't know what you're talking about." Julian finally looked at him fully. "I know exactly what I'm talking about, because I was the one who signed off on the temporary cover." The room erupted. "You?" someone whispered. Julian didn't flinch. "I believed him when he said he needed time. I believed protecting the company meant protecting him. I was wrong." Nathan's composure collapsed in real time. "You can't do this to me." Julian's expression hardened. "You did it to yourself." A board member stood abruptly. "Are you telling us the CEO has been operating under undisclosed impairment?" Julian nodded once. "Yes." Another voice followed. "Then every financial statement since that period is compromised." Phones were no longer subtle. Messages flew. Whispers sharpened into conclusions. Nathan backed away slowly, as if the room itself were turning on him. "Evelyn," he said hoarsely, "you know me. You know this isn't fair." Evelyn met his gaze. "I know," she said quietly. "And you taught me that fairness was never the point." Security moved then, not toward Evelyn, toward Nathan. Lucas looked up at her. "Mom, is it over?" She knelt beside him, brushing his hair back with trembling fingers. "No," she said softly, "but it's not ours anymore." As Nathan was escorted away from the center of the room, the truth settled like a final verdict. He hadn't lost because he was exposed. He lost because every lie he built to survive had finally collided. And this time, there was no one left to save him. Nathan Whitmore did not go quietly. That became clear less than 48 hours after the gala. The headlines were still spreading, the footage still looping on every financial network, when Evelyn's phone rang at dawn. She knew it wasn't good news by the way her chest tightened before she even answered. "Ms. Carter," the voice said briskly, "this is Family Court Services. You've been named in an emergency filing regarding custodial fitness. You're required to appear tomorrow morning." Evelyn sat up slowly, the room tilting. Lucas stirred beside her, half asleep. "What kind of filing?" she asked. "A temporary petition alleging emotional manipulation of a minor and exposure to public distress," the woman replied. "The petitioner is Nathan Whitmore." For a moment, Evelyn couldn't breathe. After everything. After the truth. After the world watched him fall. He was still trying to take her son. The hearing moved fast. Too fast. That was the point. Nathan's attorneys argued that the gala had traumatized Lucas, that Evelyn had used him to shame his father publicly, that the child required immediate separation to stabilize his environment. They framed concern as care, cruelty as responsibility. Lucas sat beside Evelyn in the courtroom, small legs dangling from the bench, his hands clenched in his lap. "Do I have to go with him?" he whispered. Evelyn swallowed hard. "No matter what happens," she said softly, "you stay right here with me." The judge listened, expression unreadable. Then Nathan stood. For the first time since the gala, Evelyn saw him without the mask. His voice trembled, not with regret, but with desperation. "She's unstable," he said, pointing at Evelyn. "She's obsessed with destroying me. She dragged our son into a scandal that will follow him forever." Lucas flinched. That was when Evelyn stood. "May I speak?" she asked. The judge nodded. Evelyn turned slightly so she could see her son. "Lucas," she said gently, Can you tell the judge why you wanted to stand next to me that night? Lucas hesitated. Then he looked up. Because I didn't want to hide anymore, he said quietly. I was tired of pretending my dad didn't have me. The courtroom went still. The judge leaned forward. Did your mother tell you to say that? Lucas shook his head. No, sir. Evelyn felt tears burn behind her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. Julian stood then, calm as ever. Your Honor, he said, I'd like to submit supplemental evidence. He handed over a document. It was a transcript, a voicemail Nathan had left Brooke the night after the gala. Angry, unguarded, careless. If I can't control the story, I'll control the kid. Nathan's face drained of color. The judge closed the file slowly. Mr. Whitmore, he said, this court does not reward retaliation disguised as concern. The gavel struck. The emergency petition was denied. Full custody remained with Evelyn Carter. Outside the courtroom, Lucas threw his arms around her. He can't take me, right? He asked. Evelyn knelt, holding his face. Never again. Across the hall, Nathan stood alone, his final weapon broken. He had tried one last time to destroy her. Instead, he had proven exactly who he was. The fallout didn't explode all at once. It unraveled, quietly, methodically, and far more painfully for Nathan Whitmore than any public humiliation ever could. Within days of the denied custody petition, the board issued a formal notice of suspension, not temporary, not symbolic, indefinite. Every executive privilege Nathan once held was frozen pending investigation. His access badges were deactivated. His signature authority revoked. The company he had built his identity around no longer trusted him with its future. Evelyn read the headlines from her small kitchen table while Lucas ate cereal across from her. Is Dad in trouble? He asked, carefully. She chose her words with care. Your father made choices, she said, and now he has to answer for them. That answer came swiftly. Federal auditors began reviewing financial disclosures. Trust documents were flagged. Emails once buried surfaced under subpoena. Every move Nathan made to protect himself became another thread pulling the fabric apart. Brooke Lawson disappeared first. Her resignation came via a carefully worded press release citing personal reasons, but it fooled no one. Within weeks, she was named in multiple internal investigations. Her emails were referenced in compliance hearings. Her reputation, once polished and controlled, collapsed under the weight of her own words. Evelyn felt no satisfaction reading about Brooke's downfall, only relief, because the woman who had once labeled her child a liability no longer had any power over him. Nathan's reckoning was slower. He tried to negotiate, tried to shift blame, tried to portray himself as overwhelmed, misunderstood, betrayed by those closest to him. But the story no longer bent to his will. Investors withdrew quietly. Donors distanced themselves. Invitations stopped coming. For the first time in his life, Nathan Whitmore was alone in rooms that used to applaud him. The final blow came 3 weeks later. Evelyn sat beside Julian in a quiet conference room as attorneys reviewed the last ruling. The trust was officially activated. Not as a windfall, not as revenge, as protection. Lucas's future was secured. Education, health care, stability, conditions that could not be touched, redirected, or hidden again. This doesn't change who you are, Julian said gently. It just removes their ability to hurt you. Evelyn nodded, her throat tight. Later that night, after Lucas was asleep, Evelyn stepped onto the fire escape outside their apartment. The city hummed below her, alive, indifferent, endless. Julian joined her, handing her a cup of coffee. It's over, he said. She shook her head slightly. No, she said. It's finished. There was a difference. Nathan's actions had finally circled back to him. Not through cruelty, Not through revenge, through consequence. He lost control because he abused it. He lost credibility because he traded truth for convenience. He lost his family because he treated love like leverage. Inside, Lucas slept peacefully, unaware of the battles fought in his name. And for the first time since the hospital room, Evelyn felt the weight lift from her chest. Justice hadn't come with applause. It came with silence, the kind that meant the danger had passed. Nathan Whitmore's world didn't end with a courtroom verdict or a board decision. It ended quietly, in the ways that hurt the most. The penthouse was sold within 2 months, not because he wanted to downsize, but because he had to. Legal fees drained accounts faster than he expected. Former allies returned calls with polite delays. The man who once commanded rooms now waited in reception areas, watching assistants avoid his eyes. Evelyn learned these things indirectly, through short articles buried beneath newer headlines, through whispers from people who once wouldn't acknowledge her existence. She never asked for details. She didn't need them. Nathan tried once to reach out. An email arrived late one night, subject line empty, no accusations, no threats. Just a few disjointed sentences about regret, pressure, misunderstanding. He ended it with a line that felt almost absurd in its timing. "I hope someday you'll understand why I did what I did." Evelyn read it once. Then she closed her laptop and deleted it without responding. Understanding was no longer her responsibility. Her life had changed in quieter ways. The studio in Brooklyn offered her a full-time operations role after noticing how naturally she handled their finances. She didn't announce the promotion. She simply came home one evening with groceries she didn't have to count twice and cooked dinner without anxiety tightening her chest. Lucas noticed. "You're smiling more," he said one night, swinging his legs from a chair too big for him. Evelyn smiled at that. "I am." At school, things shifted too. Teachers stopped asking cautious questions. Forms no longer required explanations. Lucas was invited to birthday parties without awkward pauses. He slept through the night more often, his nightmares fading as safety replaced fear. One afternoon, while walking through Central Park, Lucas stopped suddenly. "Mom," he said, "do you think Dad is sad?" Evelyn considered the question carefully. "I think he's facing the results of his choices," she said. "And that's not something you caused." Lucas nodded, accepting it in the way only children can. Julian remained steady through it all. He didn't insert himself where he wasn't needed. He showed up when he said he would. He listened. He waited. One evening, as they sat on a park bench watching Lucas play, Julian spoke quietly. "I didn't expect this," he admitted. "Not the outcome, you." Evelyn met his gaze. "Neither did I." He smiled faintly. "You didn't just survive. You changed the direction of things." She shook her head. "I just stopped letting them erase us." The city moved around them, indifferent and alive. For the first time in years, Evelyn felt like she was moving with it instead of being pushed aside. Nathan Whitmore lost his reputation, his power, and the illusion that control could replace integrity. Evelyn Carter gained something far more valuable: peace, stability, and a future built on truth instead of fear. And for the first time, that future felt wide open. The wedding wasn't announced in magazines. There were no headlines, no photographers waiting behind hedges, no carefully curated guest list designed to impress anyone. It happened on a quiet spring morning in Central Park. The trees were just beginning to bloom, soft green against the gray stone paths. Joggers passed without stopping. A street musician played a slow, familiar tune somewhere in the distance. Life moved on, unaware that something sacred was taking place. Evelyn stood beneath a wide oak tree, holding Lucas's hand. He wore a small gray suit and sneakers he insisted were lucky. When he looked up at her, his smile was open and unguarded, the kind that only exists when a child finally feels safe. "You ready?" he asked. She nodded. "I've been ready for a long time." Julian waited a few steps away. No tuxedo, no grand gestures, just a simple suit, his hands clasped loosely in front of him, his expression calm but unmistakably full. When Evelyn walked toward him, there was no rush of nerves, no fear of being replaced, no instinct to make herself smaller, only certainty. The ceremony was brief, honest, promises spoken plainly, without drama or performance. When Julian said his vows, he didn't promise to rescue her. He promised to stand beside her. When it was Evelyn's turn, she didn't speak about the past. She spoke about choice. "I choose a life where truth is never hidden," she said, "where children are never treated as burdens, and where love does not require erasure." Julian smiled, eyes shining. When they were done, Lucas stepped forward, holding something carefully in both hands. "I have something too," he said, serious. Evelyn's breath caught. Julian knelt to Lucas's level. "Yeah?" Lucas nodded. "I was wondering, if it's okay, if I could have your last name." Silence fell. Julian glanced at Evelyn, then back at Lucas. His voice was steady but thick with emotion. "It would be an honor." Evelyn felt tears slip free, unashamed this time. Afterward, they walked through the park together. No reception, no speeches. Just sandwiches from a nearby cafe, laughter, and the sound of Lucas racing ahead on the path. Later that evening, back in their apartment, no longer cramped, no longer temporary, Evelyn stood by the window, watching the city lights flicker on. She thought of the woman she had been, the one who signed papers while exhausted, the one who was told to disappear quietly, the one who believed survival was the best she could hope for. She smiled softly, because survival had turned into something more. She had her work, a career built on her own name. She had her child, safe, seen, unhidden, and she had love, not loud, not controlling, not conditional. Julian came up behind her, resting a hand lightly at her back. "You okay?" he asked. Evelyn nodded. "I finally am." And somewhere in the city, Nathan Whitmore lived with the consequences of his choices, but Evelyn no longer carried them. Her story didn't end with revenge. It ended with peace, and that, she knew, was the greatest victory of all. So, the story has come to an end. And if you're still here with us at this moment, then I believe something in this journey touched your heart in a quiet, personal way. Maybe it reminded you of a time you felt erased. Maybe it mirrored a battle you never talk about. Or maybe it simply reminded you that dignity, once lost, can be reclaimed. What this story shows us is not just revenge or justice, but inner strength, the kind that grows silently while the world underestimates you. As the Stoic philosopher Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." Evelyn didn't win by shouting louder. She won by standing still, by refusing to disappear, by protecting what mattered most. Another Stoic truth says, "What stands in the way becomes the way." Every obstacle meant to break her became the very path that led her to healing, truth, and love. And maybe that's the lesson for us. Pain doesn't mean the end. Silence doesn't mean weakness. Sometimes the hardest seasons are shaping us for a life that finally fits. If this story spoke to you, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us keep telling stories that heal, remind, and inspire. Thank you for staying until the end. You're not alone, and your story isn't over yet.